Welcome to the deep dive. So we've got a stack of sources here, news, market reports, analyses, all looking at the crypto and blockchain world for the week of May 19th to May 25th, 2025. It's a fast-moving space, as always.
Absolutely. And our mission for this deep dive is really to sift through all that information. Pull out what actually mattered. What were the big shifts, the key developments during that week?
Yeah, what's the signal, not just the noise?
Exactly. We're looking at market moves, regulation talk, tech adoption, even some real-world events, trying to understand what it all tells us about where crypto is right now and maybe where it's going.
And it was quite a week, wasn't it? Lots to chew on. We saw Bitcoin hitting, well, eye-watering new highs.
Definitely.
Some major legislative stuff bubbling up, tech giants making moves, and honestly, some pretty wild real-world stories, too. Some quite concerning.
Real mix.
Okay, let's just dive in. We probably have to start with the market, right? The sources certainly led with it. Bitcoin smashing its all-time high.
That was the big headline, yeah. May 21st, it surged right up, briefly touched $109,846.08.
Wow, just under $110,000. That's incredible. What did the report say was driving that climb?
Well, the sources pointed to a few things. Definitely increased institutional investments, more big players getting involved.
Okay.
They also mentioned a weaker U.S. dollar as helping the environment and just this general feeling, this optimism that maybe some regulatory clarity is finally on the horizon.
Right, the regulation piece always looms large.
It does. And crucially, the sources really highlighted the continued significant inflows into those spot Bitcoin ETFs. That seemed to be a primary engine.
Yeah, those ETFs have been a game changer.
For sure. It reinforces that view of Bitcoin as maybe a safe haven asset, especially when the traditional markets are looking a bit shaky.
That makes sense. People looking for alternatives, but it wasn't just straight up, was it? I think the sources mentioned a little pullback, too.
Correct, yeah. Even with that strong performance, Bitcoin did dip a bit on May 19th, dropped about 0.9%, trading around $103,011 after being higher, near $106,518 earlier that day.
So still volatile then?
Oh, absolutely. It just reminds you that even with these highs, volatility is still very much part of the game.
So record highs, but still the usual crypto swings. Okay, what else is happening on the market front? The CME Group made a move, right?
Yes, that was noteworthy. CME Group, the big derivatives marketplace, they launched cash-settled XRP futures contracts. That was on May 19th as well.
Okay, cash-settled futures. Can you quickly break that down? Why is this specific launch for XRP a big deal?
Sure. So think of cash-settled futures like placing a bet on where the price will go. You agree on a price now for a future date, but instead of actually swapping XRP coins later...
You just settle the difference in cash.
Exactly. Based on how the price moved. It's a standard tool in traditional finance, really. Launching them for XRP is significant because it gives institutional investors, the big funds, a regulated way to get exposure to XRP's price movements.
Without actually having to hold the coins themselves.
Right. Or they can use it to hedge their positions if they do hold XRP. The sources suggest this should help boost XRP's legitimacy, maybe its liquidity too, pulling it further into that traditional finance world.
Okay, so we've got Bitcoin hitting these crazy highs, partly driven by institutional money, and then a new regulated product for XRP from a major exchange like CME. What's the takeaway here about crypto and traditional finance, and what might that mean for you listening?
I think it shows the lines are just getting blurrier and blurrier. Crypto isn't this totally separate thing anymore. It's becoming integrated into major financial markets.
Which brings opportunities?
Opportunities, yes, but also probably new kinds of complexities, more scrutiny, which actually leads us nicely into the next big theme from the sources. Regulation.
Ah, yes. The rules of the road, or the lack thereof sometimes. What was happening on the regulatory front this week?
Well, a big thing highlighted was the anticipation building around a U.S. Senate vote, something called the Genius Act.
The Genius Act. That sounds ambitious. What's it actually about, according to the sources?
Yeah. The reports describe it as a bipartisan effort, which is interesting in itself these days. And it's specifically focused on regulating stablecoins.
Okay, stablecoins. That's been a hot topic.
Definitely. The goal seems to be setting up clearer guidelines, how they're issued, how they're overseen. It really could reshape a big part of the digital currency landscape, depending on what the final rules look like. Could provide clarity, could add restrictions.
So potential federal action there. But it wasn't just happening at the federal level, right?
Yeah.
The sources also mentioned some noise coming out of New York City.
Exactly. NYC Mayor Eric Adams has apparently been pretty vocal about wanting changes to New York State's crypto rules.
And what was the specific stance the sources reported?
Well, At a recent summit, he reportedly sided with some prominent crypto investors, calling for New York State to actually get rid of its BIT license regulations.
Get rid of the BIT license. Wow, that's been around for a while and often criticized by the industry. What was the argument for ditching it?
The main arguments cited were economic. Basically, that easing up on those rules would attract potentially billions in investment into the city.
Billions?
Yeah, and help make New York a kind of crypto sanctuary city was the phrase used.
Yeah.
A place that welcomes these businesses. The BIT license is that state-level framework. Requires a special license for virtual currency businesses operating in New York, and yeah, it's often seen as pretty burdensome.
Okay, billions in investment is definitely a strong argument from their perspective. So, thinking about these two things, the Federal Genius Act potentially standardizing stablecoin rules, and the major city like New York possibly rolling back its own regulations. How could these shifts impact things for, the average person or business?
It really highlights this potential tension, doesn't it? You might have a federal push for more uniform rules, maybe more clarity nationwide, but at the same time, local efforts to maybe lower barriers to attract businesses.
So it could get easier in some places, potentially stricter overall.
Could be. It might mean different experiences depending on where you are and what part of crypto you're interacting with. It just shows how complex the regulatory picture still is. But moving beyond policy, the sources also showed how crypto and blockchain are kind of seeping into the mainstream in perhaps unexpected ways.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Seeing it pop up in everyday life. I saw something about churches.
You did?
Yep.
Yeah, reports this week suggested a growing number of churches, mainly in the U.S., are starting to use technologies like AI and, yes, cryptocurrency.
Churches taking crypto donations? That definitely feels like a shift. Were there specific numbers in the report?
There were. According to the source, 45% of the church leaders surveyed said they use AI tools in some capacity. And for crypto, 10% are currently accepting donations in cryptocurrency.
10% now.
But maybe even more telling, 39% said they view accepting crypto as strategically important for their future.
Almost 40% seeing it as strategic. That's significant. It's not just a novelty then for them.
Doesn't seem like it. It really shows how different kinds of organizations are looking at these tools. And it wasn't just nonprofits either. We saw moves from, the tech giants.
Right, the developer conferences,
Right.
Microsoft Build, Google I.O.
Exactly. The sources picked up on announcements from both.
What were they announcing? Anything specific?
Both companies use these big events to talk about new blockchain-related initiatives. It signals they're actively exploring and maybe committing more resources to integrating blockchain tech into their, mainstream platforms and applications.
So you've got Microsoft and Google building blockchain stuff. You've got churches strategically looking at crypto. What do these very different examples tell us about where this tech is heading, and where might you, the listener, start seeing it more?
I think it suggests we're moving past crypto just being seen as like a speculative asset for trading. Blockchain tech itself is starting to be woven into the background.
Like infrastructure.
Like the infrastructure for software, for how organizations run, maybe even how communities engage. It's becoming less visible, but potentially more integrated.
Right.
However, as it spreads, the sources also made it clear that this brings real-world impacts and, frankly, some serious concerns.
Okay, yeah, let's shift to that. The human side, the consequences. There was mention in the sources of a former political figure and their crypto activities.
Yes, reports were discussing former President Donald Trump and his involvement in some crypto ventures.
What kind of ventures were mentioned?
The sources pointed to the launch of his TrumpMP token and also him co-founding a company called World Liberty Financial.
And what was the reaction to this as reported in the sources? We need to be clear, we're just reporting what the sources said here.
Absolutely. The report stated that these ventures have sparked ethical and legal concerns, specifically among critics.
And what were the critics alleging, according to the source material?
They reportedly alleged that these ventures might be exploiting his political influence for personal gain.
Okay. And did the source mention any outcome or result from these concerns?
It just noted that these concerns are leading to calls for stronger oversight. It framed it as raising questions about how politics and digital assets intersect, especially as the space gets bigger.
Right. So that's one end of the spectrum. High-profile figures, ethical debates, calls for oversight. But the sources also covered something truly disturbing, a really grim, real-world event.
Tragically, yes, the arrest of a crypto investor in Manhattan, John Waltz, apparently known as the Crypto King of Kentucky.
And the allegations against him were extremely serious based on the reports.
Horrific, yeah. He was arrested for allegedly kidnapping and torturing an Italian tourist.
And the reported motive behind this alleged crime.
According to the allegations mentioned in the source, it was to steal the tourist's Bitcoin.
It's just awful. How did the situation conclude according to the reports?
The source said the victim managed to escape after being held for 3 weeks, and that led to Woltz's arrest.
And the charges he's now facing.
The sources mentioned charges including kidnapping and assault.
Wow. Okay, so in the same week, the sources cover these two incredibly different stories. One involves a former president's crypto businesses raising ethical questions and calls for rules.
Right.
And the other details an alleged terrifyingly violent crime directly tied to stealing crypto assets. What does this contrast tell us about who and what is being drawn into crypto as it expands?
It really starkly highlights the duality, doesn't it? And the challenges. I mean, the space attracts incredible innovation, huge investment, real potential.
Yeah.
But it also clearly creates new avenues, new motivations for ethical shortcuts, and as we see in that horrible case, for outright serious crime. It's a potent reminder that this frontier, as it expands, involves a really wide spectrum of people and activities, good and bad.
So if we try to weave all these threads together from the week's sources, you've got the market hitting new highs, fueled by big money.
Right. Pushing towards more maturity, more integration with traditional finance.
Then you have the regulatory side, with active debates and pushes for clarity like the Genius Act, but also local efforts to maybe attract business like an NYC.
Yeah, policymakers trying to shape it, trying to figure out the rules.
And then there's the adoption piece, tech giants building it in, institutions like churches seeing strategic value.
Showing it embedding itself more deeply into different parts of society and the economy.
But, and it's a big but, alongside all that, the sources show these significant ethical questions popping up at high levels, and also the grim reality of how crypto can be exploited for crime.
It paints a picture of a space under immense tension, I think. Pulled in different directions simultaneously, you see the massive potential, but you also see the very real risks and dangers playing out.
It really does feel like this 1 week captured that dynamic perfectly.
And it matters, right? It matters to you listening, even if you're not directly involved in crypto day to day. These changes in finance, tech, law, even social norms, they're shaping the digital world that we all increasingly live in.
Definitely. So looking back at this deep dive, this mix of record highs, policy arguments, wider adoption, and these really serious real-world consequences, it's a complicated picture.
It really is. No easy answers.
Which kind of leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on based on everything we've just unpacked from these sources. You know, with crypto reaching these new market peaks, integrating into mainstream tech, getting adopted by institutions, but also facing these tough ethical questions and clearly showing vulnerabilities to serious crime. How should we as individuals, as a society, navigate this? How do we approach this rapidly expanding frontier? What level of, I don't know, scrutiny or caution or maybe even adoption makes sense when you see all these things happening at the same time?
That's the multi-billion, maybe trillion-dollar question, isn't it? And this week's news really throws it into sharp relief.
Something to think about. We hope this deep dive has given you some useful context and insights as you consider those big questions.